The only real difference between him and Basil is that he was small and had a very large hen-pecking wife.
There are television moments that make you laugh, moments that make you think, and then there are moments so combustible that they ignite debates lasting decades. Fawlty Towers produced one of those moments, a scene so outrageous, so unapologetically provocative, that it sent shockwaves through the BBC, divided audiences across Europe, and ultimately contributed to the quiet disappearance of one of Britain's most celebrated sitcoms. But to truly understand why that scene hit so hard, you first have to understand the world that built it, the bizarre real-life inspiration, the creative genius behind it, and the cultural climate that made its controversy inevitable. The year was 1970, and the Monty Python team had rolled into Torquay, a sleepy seaside resort on the English Riviera, to film scenes for their groundbreaking sketch show. They needed somewhere to stay, and the Gleneagles Hotel seemed perfectly adequate. What they found inside, however, was anything but ordinary. The manager of the Gleneagles was a man named Donald Sinclair, and Donald Sinclair was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most spectacularly unsuitable people ever to run a hospitality business. He greeted guests with open suspicion. He treated ordinary requests as personal affronts. He regarded the very presence of visitors as an inconvenience to be endured rather than a service to be rendered. The Python team witnessed incident after bewildering incident. When Eric Idle left his briefcase unattended in the lobby for a few moments, Sinclair didn't ask whose it was. He didn't set it aside politely. He picked it up and hurled it over a garden wall, convinced it was a suspicious device. When Terry Gilliam committed the apparently unforgivable sin of holding his cutlery incorrectly at dinner, Sinclair descended on him with the fury of a man who had personally invested in proper table manners. Most of the Pythons fled after a single night. John Cleese, however, stayed on, not out of loyalty to the establishment, but out of pure fascination. Here was a man so magnificently wrong, so breathtakingly terrible at his chosen profession, that Cleese couldn't look away. He began mentally cataloging every absurd interaction, every misplaced outburst, every moment of theatrical incompetence. He had no idea at the time that he was collecting the raw material for a character that would outlive them both. John Cleese did not arrive at comic genius by accident. He was born in Weston-super-Mare, raised in modest circumstances, and was already physically conspicuous by his early teens, standing well over 6 feet tall at 13, all limbs and awkwardness, which gave him an early education in the comedy of being noticed for the wrong reasons. His education at St. Peter's Preparatory School and later Clifton College sharpened something in him, not just academic ability, but a keen, observational eye for the absurdity lurking beneath the surface of respectable English life. The rigid hierarchies of the British school system, the unspoken codes of class and conduct, the bizarre gap between how people presented themselves and how they actually behaved, all of it became fuel. At Cambridge, where he studied law at Downing College, Cleese found the Cambridge Footlights, the legendary comedy club that had launched careers for generations before him. When asked what he could do during his audition, he said flatly that he could make people laugh. That blunt self-assessment turned out to be one of the most accurate statements in the history of British entertainment. His early career writing for radio and television, followed by the explosive success of Monty Python's Flying Circus, trained him in a specific kind of comedy: intellectual, subversive, deeply interested in power and pretension, and utterly fearless about discomfort. By the time he and his then-wife, the American actress and writer Connie Booth, sat down to develop what would become Fawlty Towers, Cleese was not merely a funny man. He was a craftsman with a point of view. The idea that crystallized from those memories of Donald Sinclair was deceptively simple: a hotel run by a man who despised the very guests he depended upon. But Cleese and Booth were not interested in simple. What they built around that central premise was a study in human contradiction, a character who craved respect but constantly undermined himself, who yearned for refinement but was constitutionally incapable of achieving it. Basil Fawlty, as Cleese played him, was a walking masterclass in frustrated ambition. He was a snob who lacked the social standing to justify his snobbery. He was a control enthusiast in a world that refused to be controlled. Every episode functioned as a kind of tragedy dressed in slapstick clothing, Basil convinced, at the start of each half hour, that he could manage his circumstances, and spectacularly proven wrong by the end of it. When Fawlty Towers first aired on the BBC in 1975, the critical reception was muddled. Some reviewers simply didn't know what to make of its relentless pace and confrontational humor. But the public understood it immediately. They recognized Basil. They had met Basil. Some of them, perhaps uncomfortably, saw traces of Basil in themselves. The supporting cast was equally brilliant. Prunella Scales as Basil Fawlty, Basil's sharp-tongued, sharp-minded wife, provided a perfect counterweight to his bluster. Connie Booth's Polly, the sensible hotel maid, functioned as the audience's surrogate, observing the chaos with weary clarity. And Andrew Sachs as Manuel, the eager and perpetually confused Spanish waiter, gave the show its most physical comedy and, arguably, its most emotionally resonant character. Only 12 episodes were ever made, 6 in 1975 and 6 more in 1979, but those 12 episodes were so precisely constructed, so dense with comic invention, that the British Film Institute would eventually rank the series as the greatest British television program ever made. Of those 12 episodes, one stands in a category entirely its own. The Germans, broadcast in October 1975 as the sixth and final episode of the first series, is the moment Fawlty Towers transformed from beloved comedy into cultural flashpoint. The episode begins with Basil recovering from a concussion, a plot device that gives Cleese license to play his character at a heightened, almost hallucinatory level of dysfunction. German tourists arrive at the hotel, and Basil, in a fit of anxious overcorrection, instructs his staff with the now legendary command, "Don't mention the war." What follows is one of the most extraordinary pieces of comic escalation in television history. Basil's attempts to avoid any reference to the Second World War become, through the warped logic of his own psychology, an obsessive cataloging of it. He cannot stop. Every effort to suppress the subject causes it to erupt with greater force. The scene builds to its notorious peak, Basil performing a goose step through the hotel lobby, mimicking Adolf Hitler, while his horrified German guests watch in silence. The sequence is, depending on your perspective, either a devastating satire of British cultural obsession or a breathtakingly tasteless spectacle. What Cleese intended, and what he has argued publicly ever since, was the former. The target of the joke, he insisted, was never the Germans. It was Basil's own stupidity, his own inability to let go of wartime mythology, his own comically inflated sense of English superiority. The Germans in the episode are dignified and restrained. Basil is the one making a fool of himself. The joke is entirely at his expense. That reading is coherent, and it is supported by the internal logic of the show. Basil is always the fool. He never wins. The satire in Fawlty Towers consistently targets the pretensions of the English middle class, not the objects of their condescension. But comedy rarely lands with perfect precision, and The Germans was no exception. Viewers who had lived through the war, or lost family members in it, found the Hitler impression deeply upsetting regardless of its satirical framing. The BBC received letters expressing anger and distress. Senior executives held internal discussions about whether the episode should be permanently withdrawn. For a time, its future was genuinely uncertain. The controversy surrounding The Germans did not exist in isolation. It contributed to a broader atmosphere of unease around the show, a growing sense that Fawlty Towers was operating at the outer edges of what British public broadcasting could comfortably contain. The series had always pushed hard. It had always been willing to make its audience squirm before it made them laugh. But The Germans pushed in a direction that produced something more than discomfort. The BBC did not ban the episode, but the debate it provoked internally, combined with the natural creative exhaustion that John Cleese and Connie Booth both felt after the second series, contributed to a decision that surprised no one who understood how they worked. They simply stopped. 12 episodes. No grand finale. No public announcement. The show ended not with a cancellation notice, but with the quiet withdrawal of two writers who refused to produce work they weren't proud of. Cleese has been consistent in explaining his reasoning. He and Booth wrote every episode together, and the process was agonizingly meticulous. Weeks of drafting, revising, and stress-testing each joke until it worked exactly as intended. The pressure of maintaining that standard was immense. Rather than allow the quality to decline, they chose to stop. But it would be dishonest to pretend that the storm surrounding The Germans played no role in the wider story. The episode demonstrated, with uncomfortable clarity, that the world Fawlty Towers was satirizing was not yet ready to see itself in the mirror that Cleese and Booth were holding up. A show that made its comedy from the exposed nerve endings of class anxiety, cultural arrogance, and British self-mythology was always going to generate friction. The Germans generated more than friction. It generated a reckoning. The conversation about The Germans did not fade when the show ended. If anything, It intensified as the decades passed and cultural standards evolved. When streaming platforms began acquiring the classic series, the episode returned to public attention under very different circumstances. Several platforms chose to edit or remove specific sections. Some added content warnings. In at least one notable case, the episode was removed from rotation entirely for a period. These decisions provoked fierce responses from fans who argued that sanitizing the show misunderstood its purpose entirely. If Fawlty Towers was a satire of ignorance, they argued, then removing its most pointed expression of ignorance was precisely the wrong response. John Cleese entered these debates with characteristic bluntness. He rejected any suggestion that the Germans warranted censorship, and he challenged the broader trend of re-evaluating older comedies through contemporary frameworks. His argument was not that the episode was beyond criticism, it was that criticism should engage honestly with what the episode was actually doing, rather than reducing it to its most surface-level provocations. The debate has never fully resolved, because it is not really a debate about one television episode. It is a debate about the purpose of comedy, the responsibilities of satire, and the question of whether artistic intent can or should override the emotional responses of those who find themselves hurt by a joke. These are not questions with easy answers, and Fawlty Towers did not provide them. What it did was force the questions into the open. What remains, after all the controversy and all the years, is the work itself. 12 episodes that changed British television. A character study of such precision and such uncomfortable honesty that it has never been equaled in the same genre. A show that made people laugh at a man who was, in the most fundamental sense, a cautionary tale, a portrait of what happens when pride goes unchecked, when ambition outstrips ability, and when a person becomes so invested in a version of themselves that they lose all capacity to see how they actually appear. The Germans is the episode that crystallized all of that into a single, unforgettable, deeply divisive sequence. It is the scene that brought the most intense scrutiny down on the show, that contributed to the atmosphere in which it eventually fell silent, and that continues to provoke disagreement every time it resurfaces. But perhaps that is exactly what great comedy is supposed to do. Not merely entertain, but disturb. Not merely reflect, but challenge. Fawlty Towers at its best, and The Germans at its worst, or its most daring, depending on your perspective, did both of those things simultaneously. It made you laugh, and then made you uncomfortable about the fact that you had laughed. The hotel is closed now. Basil is gone. But the argument he started never checked out.